Hello everyone, Giovanny here, and this is the FYI on Youth Ministry, a podcast from the Fuller Youth Institute. This season is all about talking about race with teenagers and each other. This generation is the most diverse generation yet. Whether you're leading in an ethnic-specific church or in a multicultural ministry or in a majority white church, these conversations are relevant to the world your teenagers are living in. And we made this series with all of these realities in mind. This series is based on the ebook Talking About Race with Teenagers, written by our guests today, Jennifer Guerra Aldana, Kat Armas, and Ahren Martinez. They are authors, speakers, theologians, and my colleagues here at FYI. They are back with us today for one more conversation. But before we dive in, let's listen to what some young people had to say about race.
Most people know me as Ozzy, and I am in 10th grade. When it comes to talking about race, I think schools do have good intentions, but what students feel is that all it is just words. All they do is talk about it. All they say is, oh, you're welcome here. But then certain people on the staff will not act that way. They'll actually act the opposite.
My name is Powell II, and I'm a senior. I've been labeled as many things, good and bad, because of my race. The main one that I would say is good would be athletic or good at sports, things like that. A bad one that I've probably gotten is because I do have waves, I wear a do-rag sometimes, and sometimes I wear it out of the house. You can be associated with being a gang member or being a bad kid just because I'm black and just because I'm wearing a do-rag at the time. But they don't know that I go to a private Catholic school and that I have a 4.0 GPA. They don't know that.
I mean, I'm friends with people from all over and all backgrounds, and there's things now that are not really acceptable among people my age that probably people would let it slide 20 years ago, 30 years ago. The diversity was always there. It just wasn't accepted. Even if it was accepted, it was kind of pushed off to the side, but it was accepted, but it wasn't. I mean, we still have our problems now, but yeah.
My name's Ashley Villar, and I'm a junior, so I'm in 11th grade. In elementary school, that's when everyone didn't look like me. As soon as I went to middle school, I actually met one of my best friends who's Mexican, and I was kind of surprised to see someone who actually looks like me and who actually gets kind of what I'm going through.
And today we are back with the authors of Talking About Race with Teenagers. We have Jennifer Guerra Aldana.
Hello, everybody.
Kat Armas.
Hi.
And Ahren Martinez.
Hi, everyone. Good to be here.
Okay, in the last episode, we talked about why a resource like Talking About Race with Teenagers is so necessary. So in this episode, we're actually going to go into an overview of the guide, and we will dive more into some of these topics, okay? Let's start with the easiest and most necessary question. What is Talking About Race with Teenagers?
So first of all, I feel like I could talk about this resource all day. And so I'm going to try to make it succinct. It's a guide for youth leaders, parents, for how to talk about race, culture, power, immigration. There's language to swap that we talk about. We talk about our own personal stories in this guide. And we also talk about different terms that are important to use within these conversations and really how to love our youth well within these conversations, how to take care of yourself, and so much more. There's just golden nuggets in there.
Yeah. Yeah, you three collaborated on this guide, which delves into the topics that many of us may find difficult, if not overwhelming. Can you give our listeners an overview of some of these topics covered in the guide? Maybe you all can talk about the chapter title and give a quick overview Kat, can we begin with you and the topics that you've written about?
I wrote about moving toward a Jesus-centered multicultural community, and I also wrote about talking about immigration. And so the first one, moving toward a Jesus-centered multicultural community, I sort of just talk about how multiculturalism is celebrated in the Bible. I talk about how the image of God is not individual, but it's collective, and what that means in regard to scriptures. So like in Isaiah 2, right, the prophetic vision that we see is one in which all the nations come to the mountain of the Lord to worship. I also talk about Pentecost and how we see how the Jews and Gentiles become a blended family, and what that means to be a bicultural family. I also talk about, Revelation and this idea of a great multitude of people from every tribe and every nation and every tongue. So I just give this general overview of a multicultural community. And then in the chapter on immigration, I talk about scripture and immigration and just how through the narratives of scripture, we find a God who is not silent at all about immigration, but how God gives strict instructions on how immigrants should be treated and protected. I also talk about Jesus and migration and how Jesus was essentially one who migrated, and not just Jesus, but also so many other characters in the Bible. I mean, the stories in scripture are stories of movement. Then I just talk about, more focused on our current context, why people migrate, what are the factors, the push and pull factors for why people migrate, migration's positive impact. It's important to name that migration, particularly in this country, has a very positive impact, particularly because we live in such a globalized society, right? And so it really affects our country, the US, but also the countries that send and that receive. So migration has a very positive impact. And also, I kind of give a little overview of the church's response to migration in recent history, the sanctuary movement in the 80s and things like that, and how the church itself has responded to migration in very positive ways as well. So it was so much fun to write, and I feel like, I only had so much space. I wanted to write so much more because, there's so much more I wanted to say. But I hope that, if you haven't read it yet, that you do and that you enjoy it.
Yeah, I related so much to the talking about immigration chapter, specifically when you say, and I quote, "Migration as grace speaks to God's law of hospitality with Matthew 25 as its foundation. When we feed, clothe, and look after the immigrant, we do so to Jesus. Similarly, when we reject immigrants, we reject Jesus." Oh, my heart. My heart.
Yeah, I mean, Jesus says that,
you.
himself, like, what you do to the least of these, you do to me. And, it's unfortunate that we refer to immigration and we refer to marginalized people as the quote unquote least of these. But in society, it is how they are treated. And so, Jesus literally says it, and so to follow in Jesus's footsteps is to do those very things that that you quoted. So,
yeah, thank you. And how about you, Jen or Ahren?
So the two sections that I got to write on was words that matter, paying attention to our language. Language is something that we don't just speak, but it is the way that we see the world. And so when we talk about the way we speak to one another has a strong correlation with how we relate to another. It's a way of showing love and care. And so the language we use and the words that we use matter in conversations. And oftentimes what I heard from youth leaders was that they didn't want to get the words wrong. They didn't know how to start the conversation. And so part of it is to say, these conversations require a whole lot of vulnerability, and vulnerability will never feel easy. If it feels easy, it's probably not it. You need a little courage to step into this work. But we wanted to offer, what are some of the words that you should know or should start with? It's not exhaustive, but if you're wanting to have these conversations with young people, what is colonialism? What is race? What is racism? How does it, to know the definitions and to know the words, it gives people the tools to know how to jump into this conversation. When I first got to seminary, my background is in social work. And so I knew all the social work lingo. And then I got to seminary and people were talking about kenosis, and they were saying things like, we just got to like have a board meeting around stuff. And I go, what are you talking about? And it's because there was a unique language to the world that they were living in and the conversations. And now I say I'm also bilingual in seminary because it has its own lingo to it. And so similar conversations about race, diversity, immigration, they have a particular language to them. They have words that are important for us to know. So we talk about that in that section. And then I also wrote on power. And power is one of these realities that is all around us. The way the world is structured is who has the power and how they've organized that power. All power is relational, and we either use it to distribute it or we use it to hoard and protect it. And so what we do with the power that we have really matters. And as a woman of color writing on power, it's layered because I often felt pretty powerless in the places that I serve, in the places that I lead. I don't often feel like I have the power to do much. And yet, every movement for justice that we have seen has been led by different minoritized people groups. And so I may not have a lot of power to change institutions just by myself. There's going to be a collective of us who do that. Yeah. But in ministry and when I was meeting with my young people, I did have power to choose what we were going to teach, what we were going to sing, the examples we talked about, the stories I would share with students, the different kind of conversations we would have. And so to start to think about how is it that I am practicing a distributed power in my relationships versus reenacting the scarcity, rigid, I'm going to hold and hoard all the power decision to myself. And how do we model that for our young people? Because they're waiting for those to happen. So in order to dismantle any of these systems that keep us oppressed, we have to be leaders who choose to see where we do have power. How are we stepping into collaboration and community and redistributing what we have, even though it might feel so small sometimes.
I love it. As a bilingual youth pastor speaking Indonesian and English, I definitely related to your chapter about words mattering. And I love what you said in your chapter. You say, when we speak, we are translating our deepest assumptions and beliefs into statements. Those statements then get to interact with someone else's experiences, perceptions, beliefs, and assumptions. And that's such a great reminder. So thank you, Jen, for writing that chapter.
Happy to.
Love it. And how about you, Ahren?
So powerful. I'm so full whenever I'm in a room with Kat Armas and Jennifer Guerra Aldana. My sisters. So the two chapters that I was really honored to write on was talking about race. And the second one was preparing to teach about racism and oppression in a multicultural context. So, I mean, race, that chapter. As a Black woman writing that chapter, it was powerful and it was painful and it was just all of the things. I talk about a lot of my story, growing up as a Black woman and feeling things in my body, but not having the language for it, not knowing really how to express it. And just kind of the layers of anti-Blackness that Black people experience on a daily basis. But one of the most important things that I talked about is hair, right? And hair and the identity. So I talk about that, and I talk about the ways in which we have experienced anti-Blackness, even in Black spaces. Like I went to an HBCU, Spelman College, which I love so much, proud to be alma mater from there. But also the anti-Blackness that I experienced in a very Black space that happens in all communities of color, not just the African American, the Black community. I talk about why it's important to not just be like, oh, I'm not racist, but important to be anti-racist, and the importance of incorporating anti-racism into our daily lives. And what do? I talk about Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum and how she talks about how there's active racism that's in your face, and then there's people that see racism happening and they don't do anything about it, which they're like, well, I'm not racist. It's like, well, what are you actively doing to prevent racism from happening right in front of you, or in our systems, in our schools, in our institutions? What work are you actively doing? I talk about that in the chapter, and just kind of my own journey of returning to myself and just being proud of my history and my legacy and being a Black woman, and knowing that It's a daily journey, fighting that kind of internalized oppression that I feel like has been baked into our brains.
Yeah.
Just claiming my queendom and just really being proud of being a Black woman and all that my ancestors and all that my family has worked for in order to get me to where I am today. And I'm so grateful for that. So that was talking about race. And then preparing to teach in a multicultural context, I speak to both white leaders and white identifying leaders, along with leaders of color, BIPOC leaders, and the important ways to kind of prepare yourself to teach in those contexts. And also how to make your students feel safe and comfortable within those conversations. Like we talked about storytelling in our last episode and the importance of kind of knowing each other's frame of references, where we come from, what are our backgrounds, in order to know our young people better, to be able to love them well, and to also be able to share ourselves with them as well.
Yeah.
I just wanted to highlight in all of that, I just sat here and listened to all that we cover in this guide. And then I remember we wrote this in 2020. I think it's just important to say that out loud, that it was written when our bodies, as three women of color, we were processing the racialized, anti-Black, anti-immigrant, anti-Indigenous racial dynamics that I think back and I joke about this sometimes, but I go, how did we write this in 2020? And all I could say was it was love. I also knew that as I was navigating this, there were young people asking these questions. There were youth leaders trying to show up via Zoom to these questions. You were one of them, Gio, that were showing up for young people time and time again. And so this was a true labor of love for the church, and particularly for young people. And also, I won't speak for everybody here, but for me, also for leaders of color, to know that, like, I see you and I honor the work that you have and continue to do. And here's a small token to say, like, keep going and we're with you. And here are some resources as you courageously keep doing this work. But I don't know how we did that, ladies.
Yo, that was hard. I think we've said that we were like blood, sweat, and tears went into this resource. And I remember plenty of times calling Jen in tears, talking through different things. Mm-hmm. And, it just being, it was a lot. It was a lot to write during that time. And the pandemic and everything. Like so many layers of things happening. Yeah.
Yeah, it was hard. And it's also, looking back, it's an honor to be able to write something that I wish I would have had, a resource that I wish I would have had. So it really is such an honor to be able to do something like that. You're like, man, this is like a dream to be able to provide something that I deeply wish, was mine or that I have access to. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Can you tell us like how a practice from one of your chapters has impacted you and your students?
Yeah, I can share. So like I mentioned earlier, I recently moved and everything feels recent. I guess it was a year ago, so maybe not that recent. But in my section, I wrote one of the practices was to do some research to find different organizations in your area that are working with migrant populations and ask what support they might need. And that's actually something that right when I moved, I started looking for that. I started looking because I live in Nashville. So as I was rereading through this guide, I was like, oh, okay, awesome. Like I wrote this like as to let leaders know or to kind of encourage leaders to do this. And it was nice to know that it was one of the very first things that I did when I got here. And so it's been a blessing to do that. And it was cool that, it was something that I was almost telling my future self to do.
That's awesome.
And how about you, Jen or Ahren?
Yeah, I think what I actually wondered if I should include my full name as an author or if I should just go by Jen Guerra, because it would be like, that's just like easier, or it would be more memorable or whatever. And I remember like starting to get to read my own work as I was editing it and going, no, see the Guerra and the Aldana, like they are both families that have shaped me. It was a deliberate choice to go with Jennifer Guerra Aldana and to continue to insert both of my last names, because I have deep ties with both of them. And so I understand why some would choose one or the other for a lot of complex reasons. And for my own family relational ties, I have like deep grandparent relation to both of them. So like names is something that sounds so simple and yet is so profound. And in my own process, I've had to debate, should I just go with Jennifer Guerra? It's just one is fine, and I continue to go, no, everything I publish, everything I write, I'll continue to insert both. Whatever room I step into, I'm stepping in with the Guerras and the Aldanas found in Guatemala. So because I bring them with me, my last names are a way to say presente, like they are here with me, they are here among me. And so names and having that posture to recognize that somebody's name is somebody's heritage and who it's acknowledging who they bring with them. It's not just, what's your name? Let me get it right. Or the amount of nicknames I got, don't give us nicknames. Call us the names that we were called by, in my case, by my mother and my father. So when you say my full name, you're acknowledging the communities, the families, the background that I come with. And so that has been a process for me to keep both of my last names and present myself in that way when it could be different. I could have made a different choice, but writing this and doing that has been impactful for me as well.
That's powerful. Stories just continue to be what drives me and just who I am and the youth leader that I am. So I just love stories, and I love sharing my own story and my own family story and just how that's made me who I am today. And I really, really encourage that with my young people. And I just get so excited for them to cook with their family. I mean, I love food. I'm a big table fellowship cook the food, talk about the food, and share it with your family and your loved ones. And that's something that I encourage always and fully, and that I talk about in the guide, but also is just something I encourage with my young people, and to just really encourage conversations about asking your parents, asking your families, what's our story? Tell me about my grandmother. Tell me about my great grandmother. Tell me about who can you tell me about, period. Whoever you could share the pictures, where are the photo albums, because that is just so golden and valuable. And I don't think that we value our elders and our our ancestors enough. And I think young people too, they're like, oh, well, my grandma, she'll be here, I'll talk to her another time. But, our time is so valuable, especially with our elders. So I always really value and encourage the importance of talking to family and learning more about yourself and your history and who you are, and over food. Why do we make this food? What is it? What's the story behind it? Like, it's so powerful. And I think that it's something that's really pushed that for me too, is High on the Hog on Netflix, which I feel like I talk about probably at least once a week. But about the story and the history that he particularly talks about around food and the African American culture and slavery and the foods that got us through and where they came from and what parts of Africa, why are these foods around, what did they do for our people, and what place do they serve in our culture today, and like all of that. It's just it's everything.
Yeah. Well, thank you all. I have one final question for our authors. Okay. So this season, we are following the example of Jen, Kat, and Ahren and what they set in their book, talking about race with teenagers. So at the end of each chapter, you have a section titled Language to Swap. Again, that's my favorite section, all right? So when talking about race and power, what is a word or phrase y'all have swapped? How about you, Kat?
I'm constantly learning, and there's constantly, new things or like new words that I had no idea, or new, phrases that I had no idea were, particularly ableist. That's a big one, ableism, and how ableism affects so much of how we engage and so much of our language, like when we say, someone is blind to this, or I was blind to that. But I think for me in the guide, one of the things that we focus on is making sure that we're just thanking folks for making us aware of things and being open to just like hearing more, I know one of the things that we wrote was, thanks for making me aware of that. Let me reflect on how I can contribute to change. And I feel like that is such, these two very simple sentences that you can swap out for like anything, right? Instead of getting defensive, or instead of getting, because even now there's times where I will, hear something and it won't, sit with me very well. And I have to think, oh, wait a minute, that's because I'm realizing that so much of how I've been taught or trained, or just so much of what's been normalized for me might be offensive or might be hurtful for folks on the margins, like folks with disabilities and et cetera. And so, yeah, I think for me, it's just having a posture. I guess something that I swap is just having a posture of of humility and of learning and of vulnerability, instead of having a posture of I know it all, or I'm quote unquote woke enough, or whatever it is, but just constantly being ready and willing to change, and to learn, and to be challenged in that.
So for me, when I think about this, something that we wrote in the guide, but I've been reflecting more often, I'm currently teaching. I'm a professor of theology at Point Loma Nazarene University as well. And I have this desire to have people feel heard and feel included. And I caught myself doing this the other day, where I pointed someone out and said, "You haven't said anything to the conversation. Would you want to add anything else?" And I remembered, I remember what I wrote. And it was just this moment of how often this happens, because it's such the kind of culture that we live in. And so even though I wrote this and I've been talking about this and I've presented on it, I still catch myself doing this stuff. And it requires a constant reality of, oh, let me acknowledge what I did. And so I apologized to the student. I said, in my desire to include you, I did something that when people have done to me. And it's so, my colleagues at FYI have heard me talk about diversity improv, because that's sometimes what it feels like to be a woman of color. You get approached with questions, and sometimes people think that just because you're a woman of color, you'll be like on the moment, you can respond any question. And I don't appreciate when that happens, because it's exhausting to know what people are approaching you for. And so this reminder to, instead of pointing someone out that way, or seeing just one person can speak to this because they embody it, to instead try, hey, are there any voices that we haven't heard from yet? And also to think about, I am a more verbal processor, but to think of different ways in which I expect people to respond. And so to include art, to include moments of silence, to include writing, to include journaling, to include walking as a way of a response, to say, hey, if you are feeling like you have more questions and you want to keep talking about it, go to this corner of the room. If you want to continue to sit by yourself and journal, go to this corner of the room. If you'd like to take a walk because you just you're done with this kind of conversation, like, I'll see you in 15 minutes. And so just offering different ways to respond, and again, redistributing the way people can choose to engage, and to not hoard all the decision making to myself. And so, yeah, instead of pointing someone out for not contributing, my brother constantly reminds me that silence is contribution. And it doesn't always need to be words for it to be powerful. And so honoring the different ways that people show up and contribute that aren't always verbal and extroverted like me, because that in itself is a power structure that I, as a verbal processing extrovert, need to distribute my assumptions so that I can actually honor the diversity in the room.
Powerful. Thank you.
Some language, I don't know if I would call it language I've been swapping, but I think language like that I've been more mindful of, I think, and I'll refer to the conversation we were having in a previous episode about learning more about just Latino culture, and specifically immigration stories, because my husband is a naturalized citizen, and he does have an immigration story that is both powerful and very painful and traumatic. And I have friends that have immigration stories and all of those things, but I think I've just stepped into that much more. Just the pain of the different terminology and the ways that undocumented people are referred to, and that Western culture has truly alienated figuratively and metaphorically. Immigrants and people that are, immigrating from different spaces and where they need protection and they need safety, but the ways in which they are alienated so much just through the documentation and the cards and the way they're referred to is just, I've learned so much more about that and really stepped into that pain with my husband and just seen the ways that it impacts, people. I don't know if I've learned language to swap because I honestly didn't have the language for it beforehand because I didn't know deep enough the stories. But now, like I in our guide, we say instead of saying illegal, say undocumented, and the importance of using the right terminology and the right language in those conversations in order to not further traumatize and to further just truly alienate. And I even don't like that word either. Just truly learning more and just really learning the language of love in those conversations and the ways to help heal. What are ways to heal in those conversations versus further just stigmatize and all of those things. So that's been a really hard, but also really beautiful to be able to be let into those spaces.
Yeah.
That's so huge, Ahren. I think that language to swap only comes when you've had some proximity to relationship. And so if I were to rewrite it, like our response is to first be in relationship and in healthy relationships where conflict shows up and you navigate it. The language to swap, the heart behind that section was because you're in proximity and because you want to love well. If there is language that is harmful, and isn't that what Christians do? Our tongue is a vehicle for either life or death. And what we call one another, the language we use, it's not language to swap so that you are relevant or so that you're woke. We swap the language so that we are Christ-like and loving. And the things that come out of our mouth speak life and truth and beauty and not harm and stereotypes and dehumanization. And we have the power to do that. If you are feeling that tension of I don't want to change my language, my question to you is, how deep do you love? Because if you love that hard, language should not be something that we protect. Language should be something that we use to communicate love and care for people.
Yeah, I've been learning a lot about grief and what not to say as well. So with the language swap, what I learned from you all is instead of saying something like everything happens for a reason or God is on the throne and God sees your struggle or God's going to bring you out of it. So instead of saying that, to say, I don't have all the answers, or I honestly don't know what to say, or to say just hey, when you're hurting, I'm hurting and I just want to sit here with you. Is that okay? Can I just sit here with you? So that's something I've been learning from y'all. So thank you so much for writing that particular chapter, because I think a lot of youth pastors like me, sometimes we have to deal with a grieving student, whether it's grief from a divorce or someone who had passed away or a loss of a job or whatever. We're dealing with some grieving students. So thank you. Yeah.
And one last thing I'll say that we found, this is a resource that came out of the Living a Better Story project. And one of the things we found in that project research is that all of the students of color that we talked to in different layers of awareness had a story of othering because of their cultural or racial background.
Right.
Every single one.
Yep.
As compared to the students who would identify as white, they had a hard time talking about race. It was in conversations that they were having at home with their families, at churches. And so what we have is this double reality of grief that you're talking about, Gio, that for students of color, the experiences come because we do experience really hard experiences, and some are traumatic, some are less traumatic, but all of them feel vulnerable. And we also have students who feel vulnerable talking about something they have never talked about in their life. Their parents don't talk about, their church doesn't talk about, their school doesn't always talk about. And so there's grief on both sides. And so how much more important it is to recognize there's a grief for, I don't know how to do this. And there's also grief of, all I get called is this. And both of those conflate. That's why you need to read Ahren's chapter to know how to navigate all these realities. But it's, the grief is on both sides, and that showed up in our research as well.
Well said, Jen. Yes.
So talk about it. Literally, we may have written a whole guide, so you talk about it.
Yes. So do it.
Let's go, do it. Well, Jen, Ahren, and Kat, thank you all so much for being with us today.
This was so fun.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.
Bye.
If you want to read more about the original language to swap ideas, you can actually find them in the Ministry Toolkit, Talking About Race with Teenagers. It's linked in our show notes. You can find us, the Fuller Youth Institute, on social media for more content and videos and to stay up to date on all the latest research we're doing. Thanks so much for listening. And finally, here is one final thought from a young person.
My name is Joshua Lee. I am 16 years old. I like to share my heritage with other people. Like, I like to show them Indonesian food. Yeah, my mom makes like fried rice, nasi goreng, and a lot of people like it. And if I can't like find anyone who's like the same as me ethnicity wise, I might as well just share my own ethnicity and my culture.